So we'll get into it. Jason's, I guess, a bit like Sarah, an American who's now living over this side of the Atlantic and has been for quite a while, and is currently the CEO of Ori Biotech, which we'll get into, but has been involved in a bunch of different companies, which we'll talk about today. Jason and I met at an AWS dinner in London, nice dinner a little while ago, and everybody else was talking about SaaS, and Jason was talking about the cost and the complexity of getting cell and gene therapies out to populations, and it was like a really refreshing conversation. So he's deep in the middle of that, and we're going to spend the next little while talking about building companies and his experience of building companies. So, Jason, I don't know if you know Sarah. I don't think you guys have met previously.
I'm not sure. I thought I knew all the Americans in London, but apparently not.
She's in Amsterdam, so
okay. That would be why. Well, I'll be there in a couple of weeks for HLTH, so we should be.
Good.
Yeah, super. Let's do that. That sounds great.
Right, that sounds good. All right. So, should we just jump into it?
Yeah.
Jason, you've been involved in a number of different companies over the last, I suppose, 15, 20 years. So what we'd like to do is just talk through a few of those experiences, both as an operator and an investor, and then we'll come on to the company you've picked as a great role model, which was it's a pretty hard one for us to argue against, but we'll give it our best shot when we get into it. So maybe just to kick us off, maybe take us back to just over 10 years ago with NVIDIA, and the little bit of the background on that, and I guess in the context of when you and the team were spinning it out, like what was your kind of view of like what's a great company, what were you trying to build? So maybe we'll kick off there.
Sure. Yeah. No, the journey at Indivior, what became Indivior, started in 2006. So what is that? I can't do math very well. 18 years ago, which makes me feel very old. But I was in the US still at that point. I joined what was then a small molecule specialty pharmaceutical business that was part of the larger Reckitt-Benckiser conglomerate, which many people have never heard of Reckitt's, but you use Dr. Scholl's, or if you're in the UK, you use MSIP, or in the US, Lysol.
Loads of products, yeah.
Bunch of products, Dettol, that we all use in our daily lives. So they had a very small part of pharmaceutical business then. And I was the fifth member of the management team of that business in early 2006. We were operating in opioid dependence and pain, analgesia. So this is around the time where OxyContin unfortunately became a household name in the US for the wrong reasons, and we were helping to get people who became addicted to opiates off of them. So it was an office-based alternative to methadone. Very interesting place, area to work in, highly stigmatized disease area where patients didn't have a lot of options. So very interesting place to be. And we grew that business from 5 of us to, in 4 years, we grew it to 400 people. So in 2010, we were 400 people on our way to $1 billion in revenue. And they had suggested that I should move to Europe to start the European business in 2010, which is how I ended up in London. Super convenient time for me to move to London. I had a 2-year-old, and my wife was pregnant with also pregnant, and we just bought a house. So
there was a global financial crisis around that time as well.
Perfect timing to move internationally. It never is. It was a great move in retrospect, but a little bit daunting in looking forward. But started that business here in London and Europe, grew it to about 250 people, about 200 million in turnover. And as you alluded to, we listed that business in 2014, January 23rd, 2014 to be specific. It's not a date you forget. And at that point, it was a $3.5 billion enterprise value listing. We were 1,100 people total in the company in 37 countries. So it was an incredible journey. I had a couple different startup experiences in the same company, and really learned a lot about myself and about building a business. I think, from my own perspective, I'm happiest at that early building phase where you have a big impact and you're moving quickly and you feel like you're, really doing something. When you get to be a 1,000-person, multinational FTSE 250 company, it's quite a different animal.
Yeah.
So, that's probably what led me to taking the leap back out into entrepreneurship in 2016. But the Indivior journey was fantastic. I think I trained the first 150 salespeople in the US. And as we built that business and we went to market, so very, very interesting. And now that product is essentially the standard of care in opioid dependence. It's replaced methadone in the US, which is great for patients.
What was the driving force behind that, Jason, in terms of going from 5 people to being listed and operating in 30 odd countries?
I mean, obviously it was due to my impact. It was all down to my own
What a dumb
capability.
question.
I just okay.
Next
Yeah.
question.
Is that clear? Yeah, that's clear. Okay.
I mean, as they say, it's sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. I think we were both. I think certainly the need for this therapy ballooned with the prescribing of opiates for pain in the U.S., which is kind of exploded over that same course of time. But also, the leadership of the company saw the opportunity to really be in the right place at the right time, worked with the federal government to produce a product that they felt comfortable having prescribed in the office. The reason, I mean, we could spend a whole hour talking about this, we won't, but the reason methadone treatment evolved the way it did was in the 90s, the heroin explosion globally. But methadone in itself and opiates, when used for treatment, are themselves have the potential for abuse. So they can be abused, injected, taken illicitly, sold on the street. And so that's why they're so highly controlled. And so you want to control that kind of misuse opportunity, potential, but you also want to open up access. And those two things are quite in competition with one another. So, methadone clinics are often in the wrong side of the tracks in whatever towns you ever been in, and not places necessarily that many people want to go unless they have to. So this opportunity to open it up to, general practitioners to be able to prescribe, we had to create an abuse deterrent formulation, which would lead to, hopefully more appropriate use, but also train physicians on the appropriate way to prescribe. So there was this whole kind of mixed bag of stuff that you don't normally have to do when you create a new, drug that's dispensed at the pharmacy or the chemist. There was a whole infrastructure we had to create around it, and the whole new treatment modality, which was good and bad. It was hard and it took a lot of money and time, but it also led to a kind of self-fulfilling or self-sustaining ecosystem of providers who were familiar with the product. So again, a great education and great for patients. I think that product has treated well over 2 million people globally now, and helped them regain their lives and that they often lose to dependence issues. So very exciting product, very exciting company, and it's still going concern today. And they're looking to expand into overdose reversal, alcohol dependence, cannabis dependence, and others. So they're a specialist in that area.
So then to talk about, so then you said, but when it got to a certain level of scale, then you had the itch and you wanted to jump back into being an entrepreneur, let's say around 2016. But was there anything when you think about that experience, aside from, okay, scale's not your cup of tea, or let's say post scaling is not your cup of tea, right? The initial scale. Like what were some of the things that you were lucky about, or what were some of the things that really you wanted to bring into your next experiences? Like what really felt good? Like what are the things you liked? What was great about that, that company did?
Yeah, so many things. I mean, I think that really reinforced to me the importance of culture in a business. Every single company that works in healthcare will say they're patient focused. When you walk into their headquarters, they'll be patient focused, there'll be integrity.
Nice pictures on the walls.
Any other buzzword that you can think of will be in the hallway and in the conference room. But those things you don't necessarily feel them when you're in the conference room making decisions, or when you're in the cube making, having a discussion. Culture is what happens, in between the team building sessions, and it isn't written on the wall. It's what you experience at the water cooler. And I think that was the first, at Indivior was the first experience that I'd had in a small entrepreneurial organization that invested heavily in culture. I still carry actually the guiding principles that they sort of gave us a little card, and they sort of, and things like, it's not patients, come first, which was, one of them, but think about things like people's actions are well-intended. We assume that people's actions are well-intended. Honesty and integrity at all times could be generic, but care enough to coach was one of the guiding principles. There's this idea of how do you build a high-performing team? How do you build a high-performance culture? Recruiting and retaining the best talent is it's a differentiator. It's sort of what makes every business great. And the ability to do that in a way, as we were kind of hyperscaling, I think, Reid Hoffman coined the term blitz scaling. It wasn't even a thing then, but we went from 5 people to 400 people in 4 years. That's a pretty fast scale up. And being able to retain that culture, build a, international footprint, in a hyperscale environment, was a real education, of how we do that. And then translating that education, not only from the US internationally into Europe, as an American coming into Europe, we Americans aren't known for our subtlety. We tend to walk with big boots and stomp all over. We talk too much and don't listen enough. These kinds of cultural norms in the US need to be refined, shall we say, as we sort of go ex-US into other cultures. And so, I would be in Milan one day, Munich the next, and Madrid the following, and being able to adapt to all those cultural nuances and the ways of doing business was a great education. But being able to translate that culture, which was born in America, into Europe and beyond, was also a great education of how you do that and how you nuance that. And if you think about coaching, just as an example, caring enough to coach means something very different in the US than it does in the UK, and very different than it does in the UK and somewhere like maybe the Nordic countries or in France, or so
just dig into that a little bit. So I don't tell me a little bit. What's the difference? I don't speak American, so you guys are understanding.
Yeah. No, I'm bilingual, so I speak American and the King's English. So just at risk of getting thrown out of my adopted home, the Brits in general are much more circumspect in the way they communicate. Right. So they'll say, "Oh, you should come over sometime," but they don't actually mean you should come over sometime. It's something nice to say. And so the idea of giving direct feedback in a corporate environment, it's just not really done. It's done in sort of formulaic ways, but not in the way you would do it in the US, where you sort of roll up the sleeves and you're like, you really didn't do very well at that presentation, or this was crap, or
Right.
It's sort of, you wouldn't give feedback in the same way. You wouldn't care enough to coach in the same way in a UK context as you do it in the US. And the Nordic countries, which I managed for a period of time, is very egalitarian, very flat. They'll kind of hit you between the eyes. Americans and the Nordic guys get kind of see each other eye to eye. Brits differently, and then the hierarchical structure in some of Southern Europe is different as well. So I think learning those nuances took a bit of doing, and took my one of my business mentors always said, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth, and you should use them in that ratio. So doing a lot of listening and not too much talking is a good first step if you're trying to adapt to a new cultural context.
Yeah, you always look smart when you just listen and say nothing.
And not.
That's where I'm going.
And everybody's wondering, what's that smart guy thinking?
Yeah, I never learned anything when I was talking. That's another.
Right. What was that like within Reckitt? Was that like a self-contained independent state that could just do your own thing and avoid all the corporate culture? Or?
Totally culturally different. It was its own entity, standalone, different headquarters, and totally different culture. I mean, the culture in Reckitt is quite aggressive. FMCG is a tough business, and it's fast moving by definition. And the culture at Indivior was very different than that. So you're able actually to have this kind of pocket of a different culture potentially in a bigger parent company, if you're able to do, keep them separate and do things the right way. So it was a very interesting case study for sure.
Okay. So success, and then you came out of it and said, well, tell us a little bit about the journey then to the next major gig.
Yeah. I mean, I think that realization through that what ended up being a 10.5-year journey, that I sort of was best at that, smaller phase and more, more dynamic and more excited by that prospect, led me to sort of extricate myself from Indivior in the middle of 2016. And in all candor, I wasn't 100% sure what I was going to do next. I sort of said, I've got a little bit of money set aside, so I don't have to rush into, the next job. I can sort of pick and choose a little bit what I want to do. And I gave myself a year. I said, if I can figure out something cool to do for a year, we'll go with that. And if not, we'll go get a real job somewhere. So I hung out my shingle as a consultant, advising PE and VC on their kind of healthcare portfolio companies. So started working with both startups and investors. My first opportunity was to work with Essentia Diabetes Care, which is a KKR company. KKR bought them from Bayer several years ago for €1 billion, I think, at that point. And they were doing a sales and marketing operations project that I thought was super interesting. And they're in the blood glucose monitoring business. So started with them and started building my network of investors, and mostly in London and the UK, but also then sort of reaching out into the rest of the world. I mean, I had my head down building a business for 10 years. I knew nobody in London that didn't work at Indivior. I knew
Right.
no one in the
And they were all gone away because you
yeah,
left.
I was this kind of unknown entity. And so I started, this is advice that I've given a couple of times to say, well, because people going from what I did to what I do now, it's kind of an unusual path. Someone like with my background wouldn't normally be a biotech company CEO. But I said, I went and I'd meet someone and I'd say, who are the other two people that you think that I should meet? And I'd go have coffee, and I don't even drink coffee, but I drank a lot of coffee during this phase. And said, I'd go have coffee with those two people and say, who are the two people I should meet? And then I'd go meet coffee with those two people. And in that way, sort of built my network out and met a lot of people in the ecosystem. A lot of startups. I started working with a couple accelerators in London. Entrepreneurs First is one of the better known ones. Deep Science Ventures is another. Meeting some of the startup companies there. And what I always say, I don't know if I really believe in karma, but I would go to these events and I would talk to people about my experience, and they'd say, well, we want to know this piece of information. What do you think? And it's like, don't ask me, go ask your customer. And they'd be, ooh, customer, I got to write that down. It's like the things that you learn just being in business and being out there in the world, are sometimes useful, especially to technical founders that are often, just out of their PhD or their MD, or they've been trapped in the NHS and they're like, they've got this great idea. So I found that, some of my experience was valuable, and really just tried to add value, in each of those coffee conversations or each of those interactions, to say, like, if I can help connect this person to that person, there's value there. If I can help do some pro bono work, which I did a lot of, on most of my expertise is marketing, sales, operations. If I could help in those areas, I would. And the network started to build, and every single opportunity, that we'll probably talk about for the rest of the time, and or that I've sort of generated since, have been a result of that. A result of, people move the needle. People are what's important in this world. And so meeting those people and then trying to add value to those conversations led me eventually to Ori and to the investments that I've made, the board roles that I have. And my whole career for the last, however long it's been, 8 years since then.
So that's pretty unstructured, as most people. It's quite, you go and have conversations with people and they lead you. There's no like magic plan, and so much just like going out and helping. And then at a certain point in that journey, you decided that it's time to get back into the hot seat.
Well, I say almost by accident. So I was working actually with a family office who I had met through that network, and we were investing in health tech businesses together. So I currently have a portfolio of 18 companies that I've invested in as an angel, and was doing deal sourcing, deal evaluation for the family office, trying to build them out a health tech portfolio. And I met Ori Biotech as part of that journey through another mutual contact out there in the ecosystem. And at that point, I was completely unaware of personalized medicine as a modality or cell therapy as a modality. I'd grown up in small molecules. I know how to stamp out tablets made of chemicals very well. I didn't know anything about how to take someone's immune cells and turn that into a therapeutic. It was all a new world to me because I don't have a scientific background. But I was blown away by the data and the potential for this area. So the data is unmatched. I mean, these products have like 90 plus, some of them have 90+% complete response in refractory late stage cancer patients. So these are patients who, at least for the first products, most of them have hematological tumors. So think leukemia, lymphoma, myeloma, and they will have been through the ringer. They've been through multiple rounds of chemotherapy. They might have had a transplant. They are at the end of the road. They are the sickest patients that we could possibly test these products on. And still, regardless of that, they have these incredible, 90% of the time they go into remission, and then you get complete responses, for durable complete responses for 10 years. They're effectively cured of cancer. And this just blew my mind. Like when the founders already were telling me this, and I was just like in disbelief, my jaw dropped, and like, how come I have never heard of this before? Like cancer, and I've never heard of this, and I work in healthcare. This is ridiculous. This can't be right. And you start reviewing this data, it's absolutely incredible. And I think the kind of awareness that these products are out there is very low. And they said, well, the challenge is that they're very expensive. These are $500,000 per patient for some of the CAR T therapies, ranging up to $3 or $4 million for a gene therapy. And so generally they're last line therapy. They're hard to get. They're not very well covered, if at all, in Europe. They're mostly available in the US. And the reality is we just can't make enough of the products. We have cures for cancer that patients can't get access to because we can't make enough of them. And that, for me, was just an unacceptable answer. There's bound to be a better answer than that out there. So I brought that opportunity to the family office to invest in. They said they didn't like the risk profile for various reasons. I said, I'm going to go do this thing because I think it needs to be done. So I offered to invest, and I took them out to some of my network in London, and we managed to put together a seed round for the company. It's about $10 million seed round. This is late 2018, early 2019. And at some point in that journey, I lost my mind and pledged not only my financial capital, my human capital as well to the business, and stepped into the CEO chair. So I was the third employee in the business. And, I really wasn't looking for a full-time job. I was kind of enjoying the spectrum of things that I was involved in. But this company and this opportunity and the problem was just too compelling, to not give it a go and try and solve it. So that was June or July 2019 when I joined the company full time.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it definitely sounds like, okay, you took the step out, you had this portfolio approach. There's always this question that comes up with these scenarios, like, are you a portfolio person or are you a, double down on one thing person? And you kind of sifted through that for a while until you found something that really just like grabbed you and then said, okay, now I'm going to focus.
100%. I mean, I had seen from the middle of 2016 to late 2018 when I was basically investing and being a consultant, I had seen probably 5,000 health tech opportunities for investment. I invested in a handful of them, 5, 6, 7, 8 at that time, maybe. But not one had I pledged my full human capital to. I mean, I just think this was, and there are many fantastic businesses, but, healthcare is hard, and healthcare in the UK is even harder. So, this idea of like, if I was going to do something, it had to be like really compelling. And this was really compelling, this ability to, Ori's mission as a company is to enable widespread patient access to life-saving cell and gene therapies. I mean, we have treated less than 4% of the available patient population with these therapies. And unfortunately, if you don't get treatment, the patients have the worst outcome. These are very sick people. So that is a kind of needle mover. 10 million people a year die of cancer. Another 10 million people a year are diagnosed with cancer. These are numbers that are astounding, and the impact that we can have is massive. So, I know almost everyone that I know has been touched by cancer in some way, tangentially, or family member, friend, themselves. So this is one of the biggest public health challenges of our time, and we have an opportunity to impact directly that, but also now these modalities are being studied across the board. Autoimmune disease, think lupus or multiple sclerosis, cardiovascular disease, asthma, type 1 diabetes. There's a whole host of potential chronic diseases that are today relatively difficult or impossible to cure, that these modalities are addressing. And so, if you're trying to, we've treated last year as an industry, we treated 9,000 patients for liver cancer alone. I was just looking at the number today, which is why it's top of mind. 900,000 people die every year of liver cancer. Together as a whole industry, we treated 9,000 patients last year, 1% of even one indication. So, we have a big opportunity and a long way to go to make sure that these products are widely available for patients. And that's what gets me out of bed in the morning.
Yeah, it's a fantastically complicated challenge as you're trying to address with a huge need. Talk a little bit about from the 3-person team. Now you've hopped on board through to, over the last 5 years, how you've understood who the client is. Coming back to your point about talking to customers, you have multiple, not customers, but people who can block it. Like it's a complex environment to navigate. So even if you can find the customer, you got to go through all this and talk about that journey, and talk a little bit about how the team and the culture has evolved over the 5 years.
Ooh, that's a big one. I mean, it's been a very conscious company build on my part. So one of my board directors is a lady called Annalisa Jenkins, who's an entrepreneur in her own right and sits on about 20 boards. I don't know how she managed to do it all. Medical doctor, I just say she's a badass. It's hard to describe her any other way. And she said the best thing about starting your own business is you get to build the company that you always wanted to work for. And that's really what we kind of kept in mind, is that what culture do we want to be in as professionals, as people that are on a mission to do these things in healthcare. And we've built 3 pillars out of that thinking. First pillar is around talent. You probably are familiar with Reed Hastings, the founder of Netflix. He wrote a book called No Rules Rules, and in it he describes the theory of talent density, this idea of, and we've all felt this probably before, where you've been on a team that was super high performing, maybe a school team or a sports team or a work team, and it was a 1 + 1 + 1 = 14 kind of scenario. You just had some superstars that just, above and beyond performed. And it's that feeling that you want to build every single day. You want people to come to work and have that feeling every single day. And that requires A-star talent or A+ talent if you're an American. You want top talent, and no one goes out to say, well, I'm going out to hire C talent. Everyone says they want to hire A talent. But the structures and processes we put in place to do that often lead to a talent dilution. It's where, your A's, the old adage about A's hire B's and B's hire C's. The idea of actually being thoughtful about the way you recruit, being thoughtful about the way you write job descriptions, the process you put in place, how you interview, and no company is going to get it right every single time. But when you know that you haven't gotten it right, that you have to move quickly. So hire slow, fire fast is a rule of thumb people follow, to say we actually, you prune the rose bush. There's all kinds of analogies to say you have to really care for that talent density in your business, and you can't let talent dilution happen over time. And it happens in almost every business I've ever seen. It happened in Divir. It's very, very hard to do, but A-star players want to be on the same teams with A-star players. And so that kind of idea of talent is one of the first pillars. The other is around motivation. Like, how do we motivate people? We think that carrot and stick incentives, a bonus at the end of the year is what motivates our teams. And that's why every single company that I've ever been part of and every single company I've ever seen in the world has a KPI driven a bonus scheme, right? So you do these 3 things by the end of the year, we'll give you another 10% or 15% or 25% on your base salary. And everyone, it's common practice in business. And what the studies would suggest from Dan Pink and others, he wrote a book on this called Drive, suggests that actually those kinds of incentives, carrot and stick incentives, cause worse performance, not better. And that usually blows people's minds, like, what do you mean? But ultimately, it's because we get, as human beings, we become narrowly fixated on whatever the target is. If you tell us to jump 10 feet, we'll jump 10 feet if it gives us, 10% more money. But it blinds us to the world of options and the creative ways to solve problems that might add more value or might be able to solve the problem more quickly, or we become sort of very laser focused on the path ahead. And so he's demonstrated this over, 10 and 15 years of experimentation. And what he says is you need to take money off the table. If people are worried about money and are they getting paid enough, are they being treated fairly, where's their next meal coming from, they're never going to be able to think to kind of see the bigger picture. But if you treat people fairly and you pay them fairly and take money off the table, then actually what motivates people is autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So autonomy, am I self-directed? No A+ performer wants someone leaning over their shoulder saying, do this, and then do that, and then do this. So that's autonomy. Mastery is, people that are good at stuff want to get better at stuff. We want to go, that's why people, as Eve says, play guitar on the weekends. We go, do things to expand our skill set. We want to feel like we're getting better. And then purpose is, I want my work to have meaning. And so these are the types of theses or ideas that we brought into the culture build at Ori, to say, like, we want to recruit the best talent. We want to retain the best talent. We want to motivate them in the right ways. We want to create an environment of psychological safety, which is our 3rd pillar. And if we do that, we can create a very special business. And I think, we have done that very effectively over the last 5 years. My hope is that we will continue to do that over the next 5 years. But it's hard. It's very, very hard to keep the culture. Even it's going to change, of course, as you go from 80 people to 800 people. But even to keep it in the same vein and to rely on the same things and have the same pillars, is difficult. But that's the goal. The goal is to kind of retain that culture of dynamism that allows us to innovate, allows us to move quickly. The product we just launched last week took us 5 years from the very first funding we got into the business to launch. Normally it takes 10. How do you have the development time for a very complicated medical device, essentially product? Well, you do it because you have the best team. And so that pays dividends, but it takes a lot of work to do.
Yeah. And now you've sat on both sides of you are still sitting on both sides of the table, right? You are an investor, you are a C-suite operator. And so talk about what kind of investors do you like to bring to your companies? What do you look for in an investor? What matters? And what do you think what's the purpose of the investor? Like, how do you believe an investor brings value beyond capital, and should they? Or what is the real purpose? And how do you act as an investor yourself then, with that in mind?
Ooh, another deep topic we could get into. I think as an entrepreneur or as someone who's raising money, you need to understand that if you're going out to raise investment, you're inviting a stakeholder into your business. You're taking their money, they get a say. Their opinion needs to be heard, and that isn't always recognized. You think, oh, I'm just going to give me your money and you're going to go away and let me do what I want to do. That's not how it works. So picking those stakeholders that you're inviting into your business is absolutely critical, and making sure as best you can that there's incentive alignment. Understanding how VCs make money, understand what their incentives are, understanding the VC life cycle of a fund. They need to raise money from their LPs. They get paid on carry. They get paid on returns. What are they trying to do? Fundamentally understanding that is really important if you're going to raise venture capital, because you want to make sure as best you can that you align their incentives with yours. Otherwise, you're constantly fighting because they're pulling one way and you're pulling the other. So those are kind of critical foundational elements for founders and founding teams to educate themselves on. If you do decide to raise external capital, which is a path that most, I would say, ventures follow, there is a kind of, let's say, mix of different types of investors that you probably want to evaluate. There are value-added investors. I think most investors would consider themselves value-added. I don't know that all of them are actually value-added. And you actually don't want all your investors to be value-added, because value-adding takes time. Value-adding distracts the management team. If you want your voice heard and you want to have your input heard, that takes time. And so those stakeholders need management. They need communication. So in our world, that means we have had, leads of each of our rounds. Our seed was led by Dilute Ventures, and we had Amadeus Capital and Kindred Capital come in, some very good deep tech funds, early stage funds, really understood how to build businesses and how to build teams. And they were a huge amount of value early on and continue to be. North Pond Ventures came in at Series A. They're a specialist in tech bio and for the intersection of technology and biology, exactly where we sit. They were our first US investor, great network to help us, in the future. So bring a lot of value from their network, and also have some former operators there. And they take a kind of very value-added approach. So they'll bring in operating partners who have experience in your domain and try and add value that way. And then Novalis Life Sciences led our Series B. Novalis was founded by the two gentlemen, Marian Deckers and Paul Meister, who built Thermo Fisher. So they merged Thermo Electric and Fisher Scientific together. Thermo is the 800-pound gorilla in our space, and it's kind of biotech tools. So we were very conscious to try and find lead investors that knew our field in and out, that could introduce us to the next phase of investors, introduced us to strategics, to clients, to customers, knew how to go to market. And that was, I would suggest, a good way to do it. But that wasn't those weren't the only investors we brought in. We brought in other investors as well, who didn't feel as though they needed to add value. They wanted to be part of the syndicate. They wanted to support the company financially, but didn't need to sit on the board as a director, or didn't need to have, a say in the direction of the company. And so having that sort of, let's call it more passive investment money, is also important. Being able to hit the quantums you need, but not having 6 or 8 or 10 people that every day want to talk to you about the business strategy is the right balance. And striking that balance is hard as a CEO. You spend a lot of time with the board, you spend a lot of time with investors, you spend a lot of time with customers, hopefully. I spend less time than I would like internally focused. And I've just hired a COO whose job it is to focus internally and make sure that all those systems are working, that our culture is strong, and your leadership team can help you do that. And so depending on your skill set and experience as a CEO, all of those things need to be done. and you need to pick the things that you're best at and make sure that there's other people to do those other things. And that's a lesson I learned along the way for sure.
So when you think about talent, Jason, both within the organization and then with the investors, how do you get them to coalesce? Because you can have amazing people, but they can all be individual players. So how do you actually coalesce those brilliant minds and people around the mission?
Yeah, no, I think it's leading with mission and vision and purpose is important. You want people that jump out of bed every day excited about what you're doing. I think when you start to, some of those pieces become misaligned, you struggle to get people kind of rowing in the same direction. And one of the big things that I've learned in this iteration of my career as my sort of second or third startup, depending on how you count them, there are people that are situationally perfect from a cultural perspective, from a skill set perspective, for where you're at in your business. You know, maybe for a year or two or three, they're exactly the person you need. That person, the company might outgrow that person eventually, and they might no longer be perfect for that role or, you know, for that sort of stage. And that's probably true for me as well. You know, I'm probably, you know, someone was saying, well, there's 0 to 1 people, and then there's 1 to 100 people, and then there's maybe, you know, 500 to 1,000 people. And I'm probably the 1 to 500 person. You know, it's sort of, I'm not going to be the guy who comes up with a brilliant idea. Right. If you get a brilliant idea and you want me to help you grow that, create that into something, I could probably do that. But at some point, if we're successful, Ori will outgrow me, and we'll need someone who's a very good operator at scale and can grow a global organization and build out the structures. And, you know, process drives me crazy, which isn't the ideal place if you're 500 plus people. So, you know, at some point, again, even in the case of the CEO, you know, who's been there since, you know, very early, that is the case. But sort of knowing when to either transition that individual to another role where they can be a strong, you know, sole contributor, or move that person on and bring in someone who has the next set of skills for the next 3 years. Those conversations are hard. You know, these are people that have been with you since the beginning, and they've helped you grow the company. So these are some of the lessons that you learn through the process, and that maybe your investors can help you see. But there's often quite a lot of influencing without authority that has to happen across the board level and the investors to, you know, I think, you know, one of my board directors, Paul Meister, said the board's job is to hire and fire management. That is ultimately our only job, and we're happy to advise, we're happy to do other things. And so, you know, sort of articulating your vision of how you want the team to evolve and what skill sets you need, where you think your own strengths are, where there's gaps that you need to fill. You can often, you know, coalesce your key stakeholders around the vision for talent and for culture as you move the business forward.
That's one of the areas I found the hardest in Health Excel over the 10 years of people who had served you very well. But then as you get to a certain point, you know, you have to have the hard conversations. And I don't think I ever did it well, but always something felt you had to do. And I don't know if there is a right way. Like you think about what's that movie Moneyball, where he just goes in and says, you're fired, you know, and don't sugarcoat it. I'm not sure that's the answer either. So I don't know if there's any, if you have any advice, Jason, on like how to have those conversations or how to even think about them.
I have learned to be more transparent with my feelings and more vulnerable in a professional environment, because I think it leads to empathy and being empathetic and understanding that, you know, essentially putting yourself in the other person's shoes and trying to be human about it. You know, this is a business decision, but these are human beings that are impacted, and trying to be as open and honest and, you know, careful and helpful for those people on the way out and support them and honest. And, you know, these are human characteristics that hopefully you can bring to these very kind of unpleasant for everyone and hard conversations. But if you truly care about the people, which often we do because they've been part of our journey, we want to help and make sure that they land somewhere great. And actually, you know, I've learned, a comfort for me has been that I have learned through my career. I have unfortunately had to have a lot of these hard conversations over the last, you know, 15 years. Most often, if the person isn't working in the role, they know it and everyone else knows it. And so when you have that conversation, it's actually quite a relief for them. And oftentimes if they leave a role that's not working and they go somewhere else, that they have a great opportunity to add value there. Maybe they're not an A-star player anymore in the role that you're in at your company, but they're going to be an A-star player in another role at another company. So it's actually good for them and good for the business. And when you sort of can frame it that way, and I have yet to have a person who's left one of my teams who hasn't found a great role and hasn't been, equally happy or more in that role. And I think that gives you a bit of comfort that, you didn't ruin anyone's life, and things have, things go on. So,
Right.
Yeah. So now let's go back to the big company space. You chose Apple as as a great company, which is interesting, right? Because that's definitely not your favorite space to play in terms of size of company, right?
No, for sure not.
So talk to us about that. What when you were thinking about what makes a great company, why Apple?
I mean, it's not a question I've been asked before, so it was really kind of interesting to go through the thought process. And I think what I admire about the story is a couple things. So obviously it was a multi-founder situation. So you had Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, and they went through a huge amount of ups and downs, right? To the point where the company was about to go out of business and Steve Jobs left, and things don't work immediately always, perfectly.
They never do.
Tells a good story about actually, you can have a little bit of success and then things can go downhill pretty quickly.
Right.
You have to be resilient. You have to figure out, well, how are we going to save this business? What do we need to do to make it a success? And how potentially, one innovation, that you could argue that the iPhone saved Apple and has made it into the company that it is today. And what is interesting about that product in particular has kind of led me down this thought process to say, is the iPhone, or was it when it launched, the best piece of technology out there? I think most people would say Samsung or others have equally good or better technology. And so the best technology doesn't always win. What does? You need to have good enough technology for sure. You can't have crap technology and have it, in a fancy package, because that's not the way it works. But what's interesting about Apple is that they were selling a vision and a brand and experience beyond just hardware. They were sort of the first company to wrap, I would say, an experience and a brand identity around a piece of hardware to that extent. I mean, others had tried, but Dell kind of came in the computer space, efficient, low cost, just-in-time production, supply chain. That was their USP. Apple went, premium priced, premium market, brand forward, wrapping a whole experience and ecosystem around a piece of hardware. A phone itself, a mobile phone back in the days of a Nokia, wasn't that sexy. It wasn't a status symbol for sure. It was a piece of efficiency tool. It's sort of, I could make phone calls. If I had to, I could send a text message by pushing C about 15 times to get to the letter I wanted. But, it's sort of, that was the standard, that was the market then. And Apple changed the game on hardware in general, not just phones, by wrapping this sort of experience around it, and then an ecosystem. And they have become not only a leading hardware provider and expanded into, iPods and computers, which they were always in, and other things, but also 25% of their revenue comes from software, comes from the App Store, it comes from their, what they call services in their annual report. So this is about delighting the customer. It's like you make a brand promise to say, when you take an iPhone out of the box, it's going to work first time. When you turn it on, it's simple to use, it's easily usable. We've all seen a baby swipe and then click an app and then start playing. I mean, how simple. It takes zero training. And I think there's something incredibly elegant about what Apple has built, in that sort of combination of hardware and services, and about the brand and the experience, the ease of use, the usability. And that's why people are so loyal to that brand. And they built a multi-trillion, I don't know how many, 3, 4, $5 trillion business off the back of that singular innovation. It wasn't that they had the best technology. They didn't have the best phone, but they had the best everything else, the best service, the best brand. They really did a lot of work on what it's like to be a customer of Apple, and focus on that. And I think that is the true innovation. It actually wasn't really the iPhone itself. It was the true innovation, is the rest of it. And that's why I picked that, because I think it's a really unique case study. Hardware wasn't sexy at all, and it hasn't been sexy. I mean, SaaS has been sexy for like 10 or 15 years. Everyone wants to be a SaaS business. And you saw Apple deliver a massive business on hardware, and hardware is actually coming back into vogue. And that's what we, as Ori is a hardware company. We make instrumentation, we make consumables, we have a service wrapper, we have a brand aspiration to ensure that our products are usable. They're, it doesn't require a PhD to be able to operate them. People have a good experience with them, and that we provide a high level of service alongside the product. And so I thought there was a nice parallel there, and we've learned a lot. I haven't bought my first black turtleneck yet, but other than that, we've tried to emulate what Apple has done in the consumer space.
Well, talking about Steve Jobs, it's hard to argue that they're not a great company. There's a couple of things you could poke at. There's been some criticism around their labor and how they've managed their supply chain. There's been some criticism around their maybe monopoly type approaches in terms of the App Store. But I suppose the bigger question is, like, are its best days behind it? Now that Jobs isn't around, and there hasn't been another iPhone. So was it a great company, and do you think it's going to continue on that path?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, when you brought in, I've forgotten his name, Tim. What's Tim?
Tim Cook, yeah.
Tim Cook, yeah. Tim Cook is the operator, and I think Johnny Ive, the kind of lead designer, left Apple. It's a different company now than it was. Tim Cook was a COO, so he's an operator by his very kind of training and intuition. So it remains to be seen to me. I mean, I think the Apple Watch has some interesting potential. As a health device tracker and working in this field, it has some very interesting potential there. But what is their next transformative product? Nobody knows yet. I wouldn't be surprised to see them come out with something that's brilliant. But it is a question. It's a question that, they've been operating and living on the iPhone franchise for probably a decade, and everything else is kind of a rounding error. So it's really interesting to see how long that ecosystem persists and whether they need to reinvent themselves again. I mean, you look at Microsoft as another example. I'm old enough to remember when you used to have to buy a CD and you'd plug it into your computer and you'd upload the new Windows version and the Office suite, and every couple of years as you got a new computer. And the CEO of Microsoft has transformed them into a SaaS business. And I'm really I feel totally offended by having to pay £80 a year for my Office suite access. But what would I do without it? Like, literally, couldn't function without it. So that's the definition of a sticky product in an ecosystem that you have to have, and good on them for transforming themselves into a SaaS business. And you've seen their stock price, I think, quadruple since they did that. So I think, even big companies can reinvent themselves, reinvent their business models. I mean, hardware as a service is becoming a thing. It's sort of, I've seen a couple, actually, I've got a Whoop on here. I don't know if you guys are into wearables, but you don't pay for the hardware. You just sort of lease it over time. And then when they get a new one, they send it to you, and you just pay a subscription and you just continue. It's the data, it's the application, it's all the other things that they provide. That is the value. The hardware just becomes a vehicle for that. So,
I always assumed Whoop, though, Jason. I always assumed Whoop was like if you're like really training hardcore for something. But
so what are you saying? You don't think I'm an athlete? Is that what you're saying? I'm offended by that, Sarah.
I mean, I can only see that up anyway.
Yeah. It's very hard.
I just got the I'm not a triathlete vibe coming through the computer. I was just wondering, but I'm curious because I'm so tempted to do the Whoop, but then I'm like, what am I really Whoop? Am I Whoopy?
Am I Whoop worthy? Well, I do CrossFit. Thank you very much. And you occasionally run a marathon. So that's how I got into it. But I'm probably not Whoop worthy either. But it's cool. I mean, I think ultimately, and actually, I got sent a Withings. I don't even know what this product is called. It's like a watch that's also a monitor.
Withings. Yeah.
What I'd love to have is one that does everything. Like, I'd love to have like the ECG and the blood pressure and these things that aren't commonly in them. So whenever anyone invents that's the thing. And I think Apple could be the one, actually. So the watch continues to add capability as that sensing capability is enhanced. So, that could be the next killer app, to your question that Apple comes up with. There's definitely a need for, I would say, better hardware that helps us enhance lifespan or health span, as they call it, in lifespan, because, how long can we keep healthy over time and keep active?
Cool. So we let it. Will we let it in, Sarah? Will we agree with Jason?
Yeah, I mean, well, if I had to ask you one last one on that, am I allowed to ask, Martin, or are we done?
Yeah, no, we're okay. We got a few.
You know, it would be about what do you think? I mean, this is just like a hypothetical now, but what do you think the inside of the culture of Apple looks like now? How do you retain, you're so big, as you just said, right?
Yeah.
Maybe the watch is going to hit it. So now like you're an executive in Apple recruiting and trying to get a talent, right? Like, what do you really think that's happening there? I mean, what's the story they're going to sell?
Yeah.
What is the inside of that company going to look like now? If you can't get a talent, you can't hit the next best thing.
That's right. So if you keep it between the three of us, I'll tell you the secret.
We have two
Don't worry, it's
two
not a
members of the
podcast.
audience who might.
I think ultimately, and so I'm a student of business. I don't know how good I am as a student, but I like to kind of read about these things and understand them. And I think the way you have to do it is you essentially become an operating company. What Apple is today, it's an operating company. They're worried about, P&L. They're trying to drive efficiencies. They're trying to do manufacturing. They're trying to do distribution. They do marketing. You know what big companies suck at? Product development. They're just really bad at innovation.
Yeah.
So what they need to do is they need to carve out a separate business that does innovation. Most companies outsource innovation by buying other startups. And they outsource it to the startup ecosystem and they find whatever they want to buy and they go out and they buy it. But if you want to do innovation internally, you have to carve that group out. You have to keep them totally separate from the mothership. Then it has its own culture and it builds its own culture. It has its own incentive system. So you can build a highly talent dense, culture that is conducive to innovation and allows us to see the forest for the trees and not get narrowly focused on our KPIs. And I think that's the only way to do it. So if you want someone to develop the next generation wearable at Apple, they got to carve it out and they got to call it whatever they want to call it and then make it totally separate and leave them to it. And that's, I think, the only way really for big companies to innovate. And that can have a separate culture like we did at Indivior in the, Reckitt's is I don't know how many tens of thousands of, it's a massive company, FTSE 10 or something. But we were this own little entity that was left alone to do our own thing and develop our own culture. And that was successful. I think that is the model for a big company if they want to do innovation.
Is that what you saw in J&J, Sarah? Like they have 100 odd companies. Was there like pockets of innovation within certain companies, or was it the J&J culture across the whole org? Or how do you think?
I think back in the 90s and early 2000s, I think in the 90s it was still extremely decentralized, like you say, with over 200 companies and that whole thing. And then they started waves of let's say consolidation of all those different entities into one big farm group, right? It used to be a couple of different entities there. And then there's waves of carving out innovation, right? Johnson & Johnson Innovation and JLabs Accelerate, but they always become, I think, contested and points of debate about whether or not they should still exist, right? And what value they're adding to the business really, and what type of talent you actually, can attract to those entities or those units within a large corporation, right? Because usually the people who are really good at building new things, starting new business, they tend to find their way outside at some point. So you might find really young talent that's learning the business and learning their way that will be energized and can go into those areas. I still think, in short, though, the answer would be that the model is definitely buy, right? It's big, buy your innovation.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? It's buying innovation. It's not like setting up this. They have it, so I don't want to do that, and there's some great people in those businesses, so I don't want to do that injustice. It's just that that's not the core there is not developing innovative things in-house. It's still a buy model.
Yeah. Okay. No, I absolutely think that's the case. Whether that's the right model is, I think that is the right model, but also if you want to do internal innovation, I don't think big companies can do it in their existing structure and their existing culture. So you can definitely still buy, but if you want to try and do it internally, you need a different model, in my view.
Well, we're just about up on time. I've learned a lot. One of the things I've learned is we should have a longer podcast because we could have talked for at least another hour. I think it would have been super interesting. But maybe just before you leave us, Jason, two very quick questions. From after chatting for the last hour or so, is there anything different about how you view great companies now versus when we started? And then secondly, is there anybody you think we should invite onto the show for one of the future episodes?
Yeah, two great questions. I mean, I think I hadn't really thought it all the way through when I sort of picked Apple. I sort of, scratched the surface on that. And I think this idea of internal versus external innovations is a super interesting one. And Tim Cook, if you're listening, give me a call. I'm happy to advise. He'd be great.
He's a big listener.
Yeah.
He's
I'm sure he can't wait for this episode to come out. But I think also, I mean, it would be interesting just, in a similar vein to talk to those folks at big companies who are charged with innovation. How do they even think about it? How do they do it? And, is it just we just wait to see it externally, we buy it, and that's why we have a CVC, or are they actually trying to do it internally, and what does it look like, and how hard is it or not? Because I think I would venture to say it's probably very hard, and we end up launching products that aren't that great if we do it ourselves at a big company. So that's why we leave it to startups like Ori to innovate and really leapfrog, which is what we tried to do in the cell and gene therapy manufacturing space.
Super. That's a great wrap. I know we're just up on time, so thanks again. It's been a real pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks both. Great to see you. And Sarah, if you have time for a coffee at HLT, I'll be there in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I'll message you for sure.
Looks forward to it.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jason.